Imagine being sold as a slave in the dead of night with no family, no money, no name that anyone remembers. And yet, centuries later, the entire world still whispers your name with reverence. Imagine being a woman in 8th century Iraq, born into poverty so severe that your own father had nothing to wrap you in when you came into this world, and yet becoming one of the most towering spiritual figures in human history. This is not fiction. This is the true astonishing story of a woman named Rabia al-Basri, and tonight, I want to take you into her world, into her heart, into the fire that burned inside her so fiercely that she looked at every comfort this world offered, wealth, marriage, status, even paradise itself, and said, "I do not want you. I want only God." Let that sink in for a moment. We live in a world obsessed with having more money, more followers, more approval, more comfort. We chase promotions, we chase relationships, we chase validation from people who will forget us the moment we are gone. And here was a woman, over 1200 years ago, who looked at all of that and walked away from it. Not because she failed to get it, but because she got something greater, something that made everything else look like dust in comparison. Tonight, we are going to ask the question that has haunted seekers, scholars, and ordinary human beings for over 1,000 years. Why did Rabia al-Basri reject the world for God? And by the time we are done, I promise you, this question will not just be about her. It will be about you. It will be about me. It will be about every single person sitting here who has ever felt that something is missing, that the chase for more never actually satisfies. Let me start at the very beginning, because her story does not begin with miracles or mysticism. It begins with suffering. Rabia was born in Basra, in present-day Iraq, sometime in the early 8th century, into a family so poor that, according to tradition, her father did not even have a piece of cloth to wrap his newborn daughter in, nor a drop of oil to light a lamp in the house. She was the 4th daughter born into that household, which is why some accounts say she was named Rabia, meaning fourth. 4 daughters, no sons, in a society that placed immense value on male heirs, in a time when poverty was not an inconvenience, but a daily struggle for survival. Picture that scene. A father lying awake, ashamed that he cannot even provide a lamp for his newborn child. This is not the beginning of a fairy tale. This is the raw, unfiltered beginning of a life that the world had already, in its own cruel calculus, written off as insignificant. But here is the first lesson hidden in her story, and I want you to hold on to this. The world's assessment of your worth based on your circumstances, your bank account, your social status, your background, means absolutely nothing in the eyes of the one who actually matters. Rabia's family had nothing, and yet, according to the stories passed down through generations, her father had a dream in which he was told that his daughter would become so great that even rulers and leaders would one day seek her blessings. From the very moment of her birth, there was already a quiet declaration being made, not by the world, but from beyond it, that this child was destined for something the world could not yet comprehend. Her early years were marked by tragedy. Both of her parents died while she was still young, leaving her and her sisters orphaned in a city ravaged by famine. There was no social safety net, no charity organization to step in, no distant relative with the means to care for them. The sisters were separated in the chaos of survival, and Rabia, alone, vulnerable, and without protection, was eventually captured and sold into slavery. Let that detail settle in your mind. The woman whose name would become synonymous with divine love, whose poetry and sayings would be quoted by mystics, scholars, and seekers for over a millennium, spent a portion of her young life in bondage, owned by another human being, stripped of her freedom, her dignity treated as a commodity to be bought and sold in the marketplace. If you ever feel that your past disqualifies you from a meaningful future, remember Rabia. If you ever feel that your wounds are too deep, your story too broken, your beginning too painful for anything beautiful to grow from it, remember that the greatest saints, the greatest souls, the greatest examples of human transformation throughout history almost always begin in the valley, not on the mountain. Nobody arrives at spiritual greatness from a place of ease. Greatness of the soul is forged in fire, and Rabia's fire started burning from the day she was born. Now here is where the story takes its first dramatic turn, the moment that begins to explain why a woman who suffered so much would later choose to reject everything the world had to offer. As a slave, Rabia was put to hard labor by her owner. Her days were filled with toil, her nights with exhaustion, and yet the stories tell us something remarkable, that even in this state of servitude she would steal away moments in the depths of the night to pray. While the rest of the household slept, while her body ached from the day's labor, she would rise in the darkness and turn toward her Lord. One night, her owner happened to wake and, looking out, witnessed something he could never forget. yet, he saw Rabia in prayer, and he saw, or so the tradition recounts, a light hanging above her head, illuminating the room, though there was no lamp, no candle, no earthly source of that glow. Some versions of the story say he heard her whispering to God, saying that if it were not for the duties she owed to her master, she would not lift her head even for a single moment from prostration before her Lord, because her heart was utterly consumed by love. The master was so shaken by what he witnessed that he could not bring himself to keep her in bondage any longer. He freed her on the spot, recognizing that he was in the presence of someone whose connection with the divine was far beyond what any earthly chain could contain. Think about the sheer power of this moment. A woman with absolutely nothing, no possessions, no freedom, no status, possessed something so powerful, so undeniable, that it broke through the cold logic of slavery itself. Her devotion did not depend on her circumstances. Her love for God was not conditional on comfort, freedom, or ease. It flowed regardless, in the harshest, darkest, most painful conditions a human being can endure. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the first major answer to why Rabia rejected the world. She discovered, in the depths of her suffering, a connection to God that gave her circumstances could never touch. Once you taste something that real, something that unconditional, everything else the world offers begins to feel hollow by comparison. After gaining her freedom, Rabia did not rush toward the things most newly freed people might desire: security, comfort, marriage, a stable home. Instead, she withdrew into the desert, into solitude, dedicating herself entirely to worship, to fasting, to prayer, to a relentless pursuit of closeness with God. She settled eventually in Basra, living an extremely austere life, often described as owning almost nothing beyond a broken jug for water, a mat to sleep on, and a brick, which she used as a pillow. Imagine that. A woman who could have, by her later reputation and the admiration of the wealthy and powerful who sought her out, lived in considerable comfort, chose instead to live with almost nothing. Why? Because for Rabia, ownership of things had become almost a burden, a distraction, a chain far heavier than the literal chains of slavery she had once worn. She understood something most of us spend our entire lives trying to avoid understanding: that the things we accumulate often end up owning us far more than we ever own them. There is a story told about her that beautifully illustrates this point. It is said that on the night of celebration, the night before Eid, when most people were preparing festive meals, decorating their homes, and rejoicing in anticipation of the holiday, a friend visited Rabia and noticed she had no oil for her lamp, no food prepared, nothing that resembled the preparations everyone else was making. When asked why she had not prepared anything for the celebration, Rabia is said to have responded with words to the effect that her heart was so filled with the joy of God's nearness that she required nothing else to celebrate. While the rest of the world busied itself with external markers of joy, she had already found a well of internal joy that no festival, no decoration, no feast could rival. This brings us to the deeper, more profound layer of Rabia's rejection of the world, and this is where her story transforms from simply admirable into something that should genuinely shake each of us to our core. Rabia is most famously known for articulating a radical, almost revolutionary concept of love for the divine, a love that was not transactional, not conditional, not motivated by reward or punishment, but utterly, completely selfless. There is a famous account of her walking through the streets of Basra, carrying a torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. When someone asked her what on earth she was doing, she reportedly said that she intended to set fire to paradise and pour water on the flames of hell, so that people would stop worshipping God out of fear of hell or desire for paradise, and instead worship Him purely because He is worthy of worship, purely out of love, with no ulterior motive whatsoever. I want you to really absorb the magnitude of that statement. Think about how much of human devotion, religious or otherwise, is actually rooted in self-interest. We pray because we want something. We are good because we fear consequences. We chase relationships because we want to feel loved, wanted, validated. Even our spirituality, for many of us, becomes a transaction. I do this, so God gives me that. I avoid this sin, so I am rewarded with paradise. Rabia looked at this entire framework and said, essentially, this is not love. This is bargaining. She wanted a love so pure that it sought nothing in return, not paradise, not relief from suffering, not anything except the sheer privilege of being near the one she loved. This is precisely why she rejected the world. It was not that the world was inherently evil or that pleasure was inherently sinful. It was that the world, with all its rewards and comforts, had become for her a competitor to the purity of her love for God. And when given the choice choice between the love of the world and the love of the divine. She chose with absolute unwavering clarity. There is another story, perhaps one of the most famous of all, that captures her fierce, uncompromising devotion. It is narrated that several of the most respected men of her time, scholars, mystics, even some accounts suggest rulers, sought her hand in marriage. These were men of status, wealth, and influence, men whose proposal alone would have been considered a tremendous honor for most women of that era. Among them, it is said, was even Rabia al-Basri, one of the most revered religious figures of his generation, a man whose own piety was legendary. Yet Rabia turned down every single proposal. When pressed for her reasoning, her response, recorded across centuries of retelling, was essentially this: that she had given her heart so completely to God that there was no remaining space in it for any other attachment. She said that she belonged entirely to her beloved, and that to divide her heart between God and a husband would be a form of betrayal she was simply unwilling to commit. Now, before we go further, I want to address something important, because I do not want anyone here tonight to walk away with the wrong impression. This is not a story about rejecting human relationships as inherently bad, or treating marriage as something beneath spiritual seekers. That is not the lesson here, and it would be a shallow, even harmful misreading of her example. The lesson is far deeper than that. Rabia's rejection of marriage was not a rejection of love itself. It was the result of having found a love so consuming, so total, so satisfying, that nothing else could compete for that particular space in her heart. Most of us are not in danger of becoming so spiritually consumed that we need to reject marriage or worldly relationships. Our danger, frankly, lies in the opposite direction. We are so distracted, so scattered, so consumed by lesser things that we rarely even brush up against the kind of love Rabia experienced. Her story is not a rulebook for us to copy literally. It is a mirror held up to show us just how shallow our usual priorities are by comparison. Let's talk about her famous prayers, because I think this is where her heart becomes most visible to us, where we stop seeing a distant, legendary figure and start seeing a real, breathing human soul wrestling with the deepest questions of existence. One of her most famous prayers goes something like this: "O God, if I worship you for fear of hell, burn me in hell. If I worship you in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship you for your own sake, do not withhold from me your everlasting beauty." Sit with that prayer for a moment. This is a woman essentially telling God, I do not want your bribes. I do not want to be motivated by fear of punishment or desire for reward. I simply want you. How many of us could honestly say that we love anyone, let alone the divine, with that kind of purity? Most human love, even our deepest relationships, carries some thread of self-interest within it. We love people partly because of how they make us feel, partly because of what they give us, partly because of the validation, companionship, or security they provide. Rabia is challenging us, across 12 centuries, to examine whether our love, for God, for people, for anything, has any purity left in it at all, or whether it is simply disguised self-interest wearing the costume of devotion. This is precisely why she rejected the world. The world, by its very nature, operates on a system of exchange. You give something, you expect something back. You work, you expect payment. You are kind, you expect gratitude. You love, you expect to be loved in return. This is the basic architecture of worldly relationships and worldly pursuits, and there is nothing inherently wrong with it. It is simply how human social life functions. But Rabia was searching for something beyond that architecture entirely. She wanted a relationship that operated on a completely different logic, one where love was given simply because the beloved was worthy of love, not because of what could be gained from loving him. And she came to believe through years of solitude, suffering, prayer, and reflection that the only way to access that kind of pure love was to systematically strip away every worldly attachment that might contaminate it. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to hear a whisper in a room full of blaring noise. No matter how hard you strain your ears, the noise drowns out the whisper. The only way to hear it clearly is to silence the noise around you. For Rabia, the world, its wealth, its comforts, its relationships, its distractions, even its religious rewards like paradise, had become noise drowning out the whisper of pure, unconditional love for the divine. She did not reject the world because the world itself was evil. She rejected it because for her particular soul, on her particular path, it had become the noise that prevented her from hearing the whisper she so desperately wanted to hear. And once she experienced even a fragment of that whisper, nothing else could ever satisfy her in the same way again. There is yet another dimension to her story that I find profoundly relevant to our modern lives. and that is her relationship with suffering itself. Rabia did not view hardship, illness, poverty, or loss the way most of us instinctively do, as obstacles to be avoided at all costs, as proof that something has gone wrong, as punishments to be resented. Instead, there are accounts of her welcoming hardship as a sign of closeness to God, viewing every trial as an opportunity to draw nearer to the one she loved, rather than as a barrier keeping her from happiness. It is said that when she fell ill, she would refuse to complain, and when asked why she did not ask God to relieve her suffering, she explained that to complain about what her beloved had decreed for her would itself be a form of disloyalty to that love. This is an almost unimaginable level of surrender, and I am not suggesting that any of us should glorify suffering or refuse to seek relief from genuine pain. But there is a deep wisdom embedded here that we can extract without needing to copy her asceticism exactly. The wisdom that our suffering does not have to be the enemy of our peace. The way we interpret our pain, the meaning we assign to it, the trust or distrust we hold toward the source of our circumstances, shapes our entire experience of life far more than the raw facts of the hardship itself. Consider how differently we might move through our own struggles if we approached them even a fraction of the way Rabia approached hers, not with resignation or passivity, but with a deep trust that whatever is happening is not happening to spite us, but is somehow woven into a larger fabric of meaning we may not yet be able to see. This is not about becoming numb to pain or pretending hardship does not hurt. Rabia clearly experienced real suffering, slavery, poverty, the death of her parents, the harshness of desert life. The difference is in what she allowed that suffering to do to her soul. Rather than letting it harden her into bitterness or despair, she allowed it to refine her into someone capable of extraordinary love, extraordinary devotion, extraordinary clarity about what actually mattered in life. Now let's return to the central question that brought us here tonight. Why did Rabia al-Basri reject the world for God? I think by now you can see that this is not a simple question with a simple answer. It is a question with layers, each one revealing something deeper than the last. On the surface, it might look like she rejected the world because of asceticism, because of a belief that material life was sinful or beneath spiritual pursuits. But as we dig deeper, we discover that her rejection was not about denying the world's value altogether. It was about recognizing that the world, in all its forms, could never offer her what she had already glimpsed in moments of pure connection with the divine. Once you have tasted something infinitely satisfying, the finite pleasures of the world inevitably start to feel insufficient by comparison. This is not unique to mysticism or religion. Think about anyone who has experienced a moment of profound, undeniable truth or beauty in their life. Perhaps the birth of a child, perhaps a near-death experience, perhaps a moment of overwhelming awe in nature. Often, people report that after such experiences, the things that used to consume their attention, gossip, status anxiety, material accumulation, suddenly seem trivial, almost embarrassing in their smallness. Rabia experienced this shift, but to an extraordinary, sustained lifelong degree, because her encounters with the divine were not occasional flashes, but a continuous, deepening relationship she nurtured every single day of her life. I also want to highlight something often overlooked in her story, her intellectual and spiritual influence on the entire trajectory of Islamic mysticism, what we now broadly call Sufism. Rabia is widely regarded as one of the earliest and most important figures to introduce the concept of divine love, what is called ishq or mahabba, as the central axis of the spiritual path rather than mere fear of punishment or desire for reward. Before her, much of early ascetic practice in that tradition focused heavily on fear of God's wrath and hope for paradise as the primary motivators for righteous living. Rabia shifted the entire conversation. She insisted that love, not fear, should be the foundation of one's relationship with the divine. This idea would go on to influence countless mystics, poets, and theologians for centuries afterward, shaping a massive and rich tradition of devotional poetry and philosophy that continues to inspire millions of people around the world today, regardless of their specific religious background. A formerly enslaved orphan, with no formal education in the way we might think of it today, with no institutional backing, no wealthy patrons advocating for her ideas, managed to redirect the spiritual conversation of her entire civilization. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most remarkable instances of intellectual and spiritual influence in human history, achieved by someone the world, by every conventional measure, should have completely overlooked. Let's pause here and ask ourselves an honest, perhaps uncomfortable question. How many of us are spending our lives chasing things that, deep down, we suspect will not actually satisfy us once we get them? How many of us are working tirelessly toward goals, the next promotion, the next purchase, the next relationship milestone, the next achievement, convinced that this time, finally, we will feel complete, only to reach that goal and feel the same restless emptiness creeping back within weeks, sometimes within days? This is the trap that Rabia saw clearly enough to walk away from entirely. She recognized that the world operates like a treadmill of desire. You run and run, achieving one thing after another, and the horizon of satisfaction simply keeps moving further away, no matter how fast you run or how far you go. The only way to step off that treadmill, she discovered, was to find a source of fulfillment that did not depend on accumulation, achievement, or acquisition at all, something that was, by its very nature, already complete, already infinite, already enough. This does not mean every person needs to become a hermit in the desert, abandoning career, family, and community in pursuit of solitary devotion. That would be a literal surface-level imitation that misses the deeper point entirely. What it does mean, I believe, is that each of us needs to seriously examine where we are placing our ultimate hopes for fulfillment. Are we placing them in things that are inherently temporary, conditional, and ultimately incapable of satisfying the deepest hunger of the human soul? Or are we cultivating, alongside our worldly responsibilities and relationships, some genuine connection to something larger than ourselves? Call it God, call it the divine, call it ultimate meaning, call it whatever resonates with your own framework of understanding, something that can serve as a stable anchor when the inevitable storms of life hit, when our worldly achievements crumble, when our relationships change, when our health fails, when everything we thought would make us happy turns out to be, in the end, simply not enough. Rabia al-Basri's life stands as a towering testament to the possibility of a different way of living, a way oriented not around acquisition, but around devotion, not around fear, but around love, not around the noise of the world, but around the quiet, persistent whisper of something eternal. She took the worst that life could throw at a human being, poverty, slavery, orphanhood, loss, and transformed it through unwavering devotion into one of the most luminous spiritual legacies in human history. She rejected wealth because she had found a treasure money could never buy. She rejected marriage to powerful men because she had already given her heart entirely to a love beyond comparison. She rejected the very idea of worship motivated by fear or reward because she wanted a love so pure it sought nothing for itself. And in doing so, she did not diminish her life. She expanded it into something so vast, so enduring, that we are still talking about her, still moved by her, still inspired by her, over 1,200 years after her death. Let me share one more dimension of her life, because I think it adds something crucial to our understanding of who she really was. Rabia was not some withdrawn, antisocial figure who avoided human contact entirely. She had disciples. She had companions. People traveled long distances across harsh desert terrain just to sit in her presence, to ask her questions, to seek her guidance on matters of the heart and soul. Some of the most respected spiritual figures of her era, men who themselves were considered great scholars and mystics, would visit her not to teach her, but to learn from her. This detail matters enormously because it shows us that her rejection of the world did not isolate her from meaningful human connection. Quite the opposite. By emptying her heart of lesser attachments, she became capable of a deeper, more generous kind of presence with the people who did come into her life. She was not cold. She was not distant. She was, by every account we have, deeply compassionate, sharply intelligent, and remarkably direct in her teaching, often using simple, vivid parables to illustrate profound truths that even the most educated scholars of her time struggled to articulate as clearly as she did. There is a story, for instance, about a group of pious men who came to her boasting about their great acts of worship and their confidence that they had attained a high spiritual station. Rabia, rather than flattering them, gently challenged their pride, pointing out that true closeness to God could never be measured by the outward quantity of one's worship, but only by the purity and humility of one's heart. She had little patience for spiritual arrogance, for people who treated their devotion as a kind of trophy to display before others. For her, sincerity was everything, and any trace of showing off, any trace of seeking human admiration through religious practice, was a poison that could corrupt even the most outwardly impressive acts of worship. This is a lesson that transcends any particular religious tradition. How often do we see people today perform generosity, kindness, or piety, not out of of genuine conviction, but because of how it will look to others, how many people will notice, how it will enhance their reputation. Rabia's life is a quiet, persistent rebuke to that entire mindset. She reminds us that the truest acts of goodness are often the ones nobody ever sees, performed in the silence of the night, with no audience except the one who already knows the heart completely. It is also worth pausing to reflect on the sheer historical significance of a woman achieving the level of spiritual authority and intellectual respect that Rabia did, in a time and place where women's voices were rarely recorded, rarely preserved, rarely treated as worthy of serious scholarly attention. The fact that her sayings, her prayers, her teachings survived for over a millennium, passed down through generations of scholars, poets, and seekers, tells us something remarkable about the undeniable force of her character. In a world that consistently tried to diminish the voices of women, Rabia's voice grew louder with each passing century, not quieter. Her example became a permanent fixture in the broader landscape of mystical thought, referenced by towering later figures, woven into poetry, invoked in sermons, studied by scholars across continents and centuries. This did not happen by accident. It happened because what she embodied was so undeniably real, so deeply resonant with something universal in the human soul, that no amount of historical bias or marginalization could erase it. I think there is something particularly powerful in this for anyone here tonight who has ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated because of where they come from, what they look like, what resources they had access to, or what mistakes and hardships marked their early life. Rabia's story tells us, in the clearest possible terms, that none of those external markers determine the ceiling of what a human soul can become. She started as an orphan. She continued as a slave. She possessed for most of her life almost nothing in material terms, and yet she became one of the most influential spiritual voices in the history of an entire civilization. If the conditions of her life had determined her destiny, we would never have heard her name. But her inner devotion, her relentless pursuit of something greater than her circumstances, rewrote the script that the world had written for her. Let us also take a moment to consider what her example teaches us about the nature of true freedom. We often think of freedom in purely external terms: freedom from oppression, freedom from poverty, freedom of movement, freedom of choice. And these forms of freedom are, of course, important and worth fighting for. But Rabia's story points us toward a different, deeper kind of freedom. Freedom from the tyranny of our own desires, freedom from the constant pull of wanting more, comparing ourselves to others, chasing validation, fearing loss. She had been a literal slave, owned by another human being, and yet there are accounts describing her, even in that state, as possessing an inner liberty that her master, for all his external power over her, did not possess himself. He was, in a sense, enslaved to his own ignorance of what truly mattered, while she, in chains, was free in the deepest part of her being. This paradox, the externally bound soul who is internally free, contrasted with the externally free person who is internally bound, runs through much of the world's great spiritual literature, and Rabia's life is one of its most vivid illustrations. I want you to think about your own life through this lens for a moment. Are there areas where you might be, technically speaking, free to make choices, free to pursue opportunities, free to live as you wish, and yet you feel trapped by the need for approval, trapped by comparison with others, trapped by anxiety about the future or regret about the past, trapped by addiction, whether to substances, to screens, to validation, to the endless scroll of other people's curated lives? Rabia's path toward inner liberty did not depend on her external circumstances changing first. It began the moment she chose, even amid the harshest conditions imaginable, to orient her heart towards something unshakable. That is perhaps the most actionable, most universally applicable lesson buried within her extraordinary life. Freedom does not have to wait for our circumstances to improve. It can begin right now in whatever condition we find ourselves, the moment we choose to anchor our hearts in something deeper than our circumstances. As we reflect on her legacy, I think it is also important to acknowledge how radically countercultural her message remains. Even today, perhaps especially today, we live in an age of relentless self-promotion, where personal branding has become almost a survival skill, where we are constantly encouraged to showcase our achievements, curate our image, and seek visibility and recognition at almost every turn. Rabia's entire life stands as a quiet, dignified protest against that whole paradigm. She sought no recognition.